very much, Balash, and thank you to everyone for such a warm welcome we have had in Hungary this week. It has been fantastic, so thank you. So Mark and I, we're going to talk about a bit about our organisation, the River Restoration Centre. We're going to talk about the state of hydromorphology in the UK. And we're going to talk a bit about a framework for planning river restoration. And then we have lots of examples of river restoration techniques carried out in the UK. So please do ask questions as we're going through the presentation. We have lots and lots of pictures, so if you'd like to come closer, we do not bite, so feel free to move closer to see the screen. So we work at the River Restoration Centre in England. We are a small not-for-profit organisation, and we provide independent, impartial advice on river restoration and everything to do with river restoration. And our vision as an organisation is really to support the naturally functioning and wildlife-rich river systems that are really valued by people and everyone around us. And we've heard some great talks today about all the different things about Creek Rákos and what we can do to engage citizens and communities within our rivers. We have a really useful website with lots of information if you'd like to find out more about us, or do go and ask Mark or myself. It is www.therrc.co.uk. We have loads and loads of different case studies on there about river restoration techniques. We provide advice and support. We also have monthly bulletins and lots of guidance around river restoration. And before I move on to the main part of the talk, just wanted to point out we also help manage and maintain a river restoration inventory website. And this is across Europe and contains over 14,000 different case studies of river restoration. So it's a really great resource if you want to find out a bit more what's happening across Europe and look at different examples of how we can restore urban or rural rivers. So I'm now going to talk briefly about hydromorphology from a UK perspective. And it's a really important topic, hydromorphology. So I'm firstly going to talk you through the definition of hydromorphology. So we can take the word and kind of split it into three different components, made up of hydro, which means really the hydrology, the study and the movement of water across our Earth. Morpho is defined as the geomorphology, which really refers to the movement of sediment and how sediment moves and is transported through our river systems. And logi is really Greek, which means the study of. So we're really looking, when we refer to the term hydromorphology, as the study of the water and the movement of water and sediment within our rivers. And this term is really important. You might have heard it a lot in relation to the Water Framework Directive, which is a really huge piece of European legislation that says we need to improve our rivers to this good status or high status. And hydromorphology is a key component alongside other chemical and water quality parameters to support our rivers and to maintain healthy river systems. So when we think about hydromorphology, we're really thinking about the habitats and how that's made up of the flow within our river systems, the sediment movement, and the physical shape of our rivers. And if we take out our river channel, we can think, it can support lots of different species and wildlife, and that's all linked to the hydromorphology, the forms and the shapes and the functions within rivers. Now, in the UK, when we think about hydromorphology, we really try to go back to kind of school geography and think, well, what are the different elements that we need to consider when we're thinking about rivers? And this is really important before we even consider any type of restoration. We need to understand what is the condition of the river to start with. So we can think about the drivers of change within our river systems. So think about the climate. We need to know about the processes. What's the energy of the river system? How much sediment is there? Where is sediment coming from? Where is it being transported and deposited? And those factors all influence the forms of our rivers, the shape of the river, whether we have deep pools areas or whether we have kind of shallower areas where we get these riffles and features. And those channel forms all make our habitats for our different species, which contribute to our wider ecosystem. So our river hydromorphology is a really important component, and it evolves over space and time. But we all know that our rivers have been historically modified, and it's not just the case in the UK, but it's the case everywhere. And all these different modifications affect all these natural processes and forms we see within our rivers. So when we think about river restoration, we're looking to try and improve the processes, recreate more natural forms to kind of support the habitats and our wider ecosystems. So just talking through that in a little more detail, we have our catchment system that's indicated by this dashed kind of yellow line. We have lots of different factors influencing the form and the shape of our river as we move through that catchment. We have different flow pathways. We have overland flow, through flow, groundwater flow. We have different sediment transport sources and movement mechanisms. And as we move from our source in our headwaters of our catchment to further downstream, we see changes in the channel forms. We might see very confined, small, narrow rivers. And as we move downstream, these rivers get wider. The shape changes, we might get more meandering river systems. And as a result, the habitats and the forms these systems provide changes as we move through our river systems. And these are some of the kind of key habitats that we often look for within river systems in the UK. We look for riffles, which are these accumulations of gravel. They span the width of the channel and are generally kind of relatively steep compared to other parts of the channel bed. Now they have this characteristic, what we call flow pathways over the top, that almost like a dragon back or have these broken waves. And that really creates lots of oxygen and air within the river system, and that can really help support fish species and provide an ideal spawning ground for fish. We have other features like these pools, which are really good places for fish to rest. We also have things like cliffs on our channel banks. So steep vertical cliffs or eroding cliffs actually provide really good habitats for solitary bees who burrow into them, and other birds and species within our rivers. And we can look at a closer scale at the channel and look at where there's vegetation in the channel, where there's slower and faster flow, and we will see different invertebrate communities within our river systems. So as we're moving from our headwaters of our river system to the lowland areas, we see changes in channel forms and species, and we therefore get different organisms within our systems. And a key component of allowing this to kind of happen in a naturally functioning system is what we call connectivity. So that's the longitudinal connectivity and the movement and the free flow of our species. We also have lateral connectivity. That's where the river can laterally flood onto its banks and connect with its floodplains. And we also have vertical connectivity, so that's the interaction with the channel and the underlying groundwater. And all these different functions really support a naturally functioning river system. And that's what we want to try and achieve in our river restoration. However, that's not always the case, and we have lots of pressures on these hydromorphological elements. And we have for a very long time modified our rivers. So they actually look very uniform. Natural rivers are characteristically messy. They're not uniform. They have different profiles, different shapes. But we have straightened our rivers. We have made them deeper to kind of convey more water. We've widened them. We've changed the bank materials. And therefore we've changed the sediment supply and the natural processes within our river systems. And this slide is just showing comparison of river habitat condition in the UK between two survey periods, between the 1994 and 2007 survey periods in England and Wales. And if you just focus on the England pie chart, the red colour indicates a severely modified habitat, which has actually kind of doubled in modification in these English rivers since the earlier 1994 survey. And we see rivers that were actually in good condition, the blue, that were semi-natural, are actually decreasing in number. And that's really due to all these human modifications. And in the UK now, it's actually estimated that more than 40% of our rivers have shown signs of some form of modification, so changes to the channel shape and the channel width of our rivers. So there's a real need to restore and improve our rivers. And at the River Restoration Centre, we provide a lot of advice on how to improve our rivers. Okay? And just want to briefly talk through the definition of river restoration. So it's not just about restoring forms, but restoring the processes. So allowing sediment to move, allowing a natural supply of sediment, allowing flow, allowing overbank flooding. We want to try and create a self-sustaining natural river system with river restoration. Now, river restoration has changed over time. It has been historically very site-specific, so very local scale, and it's been often very opportunistic, so where a piece of land has become available, and it's often focused on individual techniques or tackling an individual issue. Now, this has been historically really good at proving very local scale problems, but actually when we zoom out and look at that wider catchment scale, actually that option and all that effort that we put in is actually not the most effective at that scale. So now we are moving towards restoration that is both site-based but also within the framework of the wider catchment. We need a restoration approach that is strategic. So it plans options that are manageable and within a wider, longer term plan. We want to try the best techniques, and we have in the UK lots of advice on what techniques work best in different types of river systems. And we want to continually learn about river restoration, and the best way we do that is through monitoring our river systems. And that's where citizen science and everyone can get involved in monitoring our rivers before, during and after any type of work. So this is a very simple kind of river restoration process framework that we often use. And the first and the most key step within the framework is really to understand your river. What are the processes within it? What are the forms? Are they natural? Have they been modified? And once you've understood your river system, you can then begin to think about objectives, what you're trying to achieve at the wider catchment scale, but also at that smaller site scale, before the design and the delivery. Okay. So it's quite detailed, and restoration takes a long time. It's not, oh, we're going to restore this section of the river tomorrow. It takes time and lots of people to be involved, as we've all talked about today. And this is one way that we approach river restoration within our organisation. We take our catchment and we break it down into shorter chunks, into what we call reaches. And this is where we have sections of the river that are homogeneous in characteristics. So it might be flow, forms, sediment type. And we use that kind of river network broken down into these chunks and then look at those chunks individually. And we look at them and we think, well, what are the forms? What are the pressures? What is actually happening at that location? And we might then go and do field work and assess in more detail what's happening. And once we've identified these kind of pressures and problems at that local scale, we then look at all of the reaches together and actually begin to pick up a bigger catchment-wide perspective and think, well, what are the main issues within this catchment? What do we want to try and tackle at the catchment scale? And how do we go about doing that? Okay. And so then we try and prioritise projects based on what is actually going to achieve the biggest benefit for the catchment as a whole. And that might be doing interventions at different locations and maybe not what you originally perceived as the best thing to do. So it's really important to take that kind of wider catchment scale strategic approach for the best way forward. Yes, the question. Yes. Yes, so the question was, how do we define a catchment? So a catchment is really the upstream, so if we take a point on our river location, it's the upstream contributing area. So it'd be the, if you were to put rainfall on the catchment and the water would flow, it'd be the area that that water would flow into and into the channel. And you can really define your catchment where you want to. Often it's done kind of geographically at the kind of mouth, so maybe the sea, but you might have smaller catchments that you might want to split the catchment into what we call sub-catchments, so they're more smaller chunks, and you look at it across a larger scale in these small chunks. Yes. Okay. Okay. So this is just a screenshot of a river we looked at in Scotland called the Blackburn, and the different coloured lines are the different reaches that we split the river up to, and this was because there were different forms and features within these different sections. So as we moved downstream, we saw changes in the width, the depth and the sediment size of the river system, and also different pressures. And what we did here was we went into the field and looked and did a survey on each of these reaches. We did what we called a river habitat survey, and we also took 360 degree photos. And hopefully this video will work. Yes, so this video is showing it's kind of Google Maps. And what we have is little photospheres, and these are 360 degree photographs we have taken of the rivers. So it allows us to create a photographic baseline of the river at the time of the survey. So it's a bit like a Google Street View, but river view. And it's a really great tool for engagement and a record of the river before or after river restoration works. So we look at the river and really build up a picture of what's going on. And then we can think about prioritising and identifying options to tackle. Okay. So I'm now going to pass over to Marc, who's going to talk a bit about what we can actually do and what are some of the techniques that we can think about for our rivers.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. So, river restoration, as Hannah mentioned, is a structured process. Once you've understood your rivers, once you've understood what the pressures and the impacts are on every reach and at the catchment scale, you can start targeting for every reach the kind of restoration measures you want to put in place to deal with the specific issues that are affecting the catchment. And this is really the important thing. You're not dealing just with a reach, a local issue. You're just dealing with a local issue that has a wider impact. And this is something that generally isn't done. We tend to deal with just what is happening here. So I'm going to show you some example of river restoration techniques that have been applied in the UK and elsewhere. And some will be, obviously, most of them will be dealing with pressures and impacts, but they could be working at different levels of that framework that Hannah introduced at the beginning. They could work at the level of the drivers of change, which could be energy, it could be vegetation, climate change. Obviously, you can't do a lot about it at a catchment scale. It could work at the level of dealing with the pressures. It could work at the level of dealing with the connectivity, the break in connectivity because of structures like weirs or dams. Or it could work at the level of the forms, like the habitats that are missing, which you can reintroduce in a kind of artificial manner. The preferred method, obviously, is to work at the level of the processes, which is like rehabilitating in the river the sediment and the water transport, because sediment is basically the lifeblood of the river. That's what species use, sediment, and they will use all the features which are produced by that sediment, but also all the features that are created by other processes such as erosion, all the cliffs and so on. So I'm going to show you a few examples in order. The first bit is about like how to restore quite a simple way of doing restoration, if you want, which is restoring the forms, like the habitat local level. I'm going to show you what not to do, all right? So this is a kind of example of restoration of a river, here like the Mainsburg near Falkirk. And the river on the left-hand side is actually in a culvert. So a culvert is a pipe, so it's underground. And what you see further upstream is potentially what it would have looked like in a more natural setting. But that river, even on the right-hand side, is modified. But the upstream bit of the river gives you a kind of template for constructing your restoration. So basically, you can use that template, and this is exactly what the people who did that scheme didn't do. So instead, what did they do? They came up, like they gathered a group of engineers, and they tried to design a channel which feels more like their idea of what a restoration scheme was like. So what you can observe here are gabion mattresses and gabion baskets. Gabion baskets are basically wire baskets that you fill with large rocks, and then you can stack them. They are used very often on motorways and so on to reinforce the site. So they created these gabion mattresses and these artificial banks. And the result of that, obviously, is that the water flew over the gabion basket and then straight through them into the ground. So there was no river because all the water was going through the baskets. So they were informed of this issue, and they came up with a very clever solution at the time, which is they hired this guy to pack a lot of earth in between the bits, the rocks in the gabion baskets. So you can imagine that actually didn't work. The water flew over the rock and drained the earth, and then it was as usual. So they eventually gave up on this particular consultant, and they hired somebody else who came up with an even better idea, which was to create a side channel that they put in a pipe across, like near the on the side of the gabion baskets. So this is really far away from the kind of template that we had upstream, and clearly not a good solution. Another consultant was hired, and that consultant came up with a new design, and this is what they came up with. And what you can see is cemented rocks on the side of the channel, and with a slightly sinuous channel, but it's still very, very far away from the upstream template. So how can you do a better job? Here's an example of restoring forms within very strong constraints. That particular river flows under a kind of large road. It's got houses, it's got like urban environment around, and it's heavily protected. Same, you can see here gabion baskets here, and gabion mattresses at the bottom on the riverbed. So these started degrading with time, and it was becoming a bit of an issue. There was no wildlife, pretty much, in there. So what could be done within this environment? In this case, all you can do is play with the forms. You cannot start re-meandering the channel and reintroducing natural processes. First thing, look for an upstream template, like before. And fortunately, in this case, there was one. So if you walked like a few hundred meters upstream, you would find that kind of stream where you can see these borders in the middle of a channel creating this kind of cascading flow environment. And this was the template that was used for the design. And it was recreated in an artificial way because everything had to be safe and flood-proof. So the large rocks were introduced, but they were cemented in. So they were set in concrete so that they would not move. There was some exclusion screen to avoid like any kind of input from silt, and eventually this is what it looked like. So you can see we're still dealing with a modified environment with this kind of metal banks on the side, and you still have the gabion baskets on the other side. But what we have in the middle, in the channel, are a series of steps reproducing, mimicking the kind of template and natural environment that we found upstream. So when it was finished, the good news is like a few years later, that stream that didn't have much in terms of fish found a lot of young fish in the channel. Fish species started migrating for it, so the previous scheme was actually preventing fish migration. And this is what it looked like a few years later. So on the left-hand side, you've got the upstream bit, and this is the restored bit. And what you can see is that even though it was all concentrating on restoring forms, there is evidence of the restoration of sediment processes. And you see this accumulation of gravel sediment, which means like the sediment started traveling downstream again. So this is an example of what you can do in a heavily constrained environment like an urban environment or a place where you've got infrastructure you cannot move. Here's another example of restoring forms only in an urban environment. And this was the Black Brook. It looks really dark, and that's why it's called the Black Brook. And that river was turned into a canal. It was over-deepened. You can see it's very deep. And it was done so because of flooding issues. It's all surrounded by houses. But it's got a bit of parkland, and you can see a footpath on the side. We couldn't touch, in that particular case, we couldn't touch the kind of the platform of the river. And what I mean by that, we couldn't make it sinuous. So it had to be kept where it was. But hydromorphologically and biologically, it was dead. There was very little apart from silt. So what was decided was to try to improve it by introducing the features that Hannah talked about, riffles and pools. Riffles are accumulation of gravels, and these gravel provide spawning habitat for species like trout. And the pools would be the resting area for the adults after they've done a lot of spawning during the day. So this is an artist's impression of what it would look like. So you would get a riffle there, and you would get a pool behind. And everything was created kind of artificially, and I'll show you how. It was done by local Environment Agency staff, used a simple digger. And here you can see a riffle where fresh gravel was introduced. That fresh gravel couldn't move because there was no sediment supply from upstream. A natural riffle would regenerate itself all the time. So you would get a big flood, and then the gravel, some of the gravel would be taken away and replaced by fresh gravel from upstream. If you haven't got a supply of gravel upstream, this will not happen. So you have to basically make sure that whatever you introduce will stay there, i.e. it will sustain a flood, and you do that by sizing the gravel. What we did in this case, we introduced the right size of gravel so that it wouldn't be taken away, but we also consolidated the riffle by putting some large material at the bottom that would basically keep it in place. But that's not enough for a riffle to function properly, because in an environment where it is really slow flowing, if you put some gravel in, what's going to happen is that silt is going to deposit at the top of your riffle. And gradually, the silt will be covering everything you've done, all the gravel you've put in. So to make sure that this doesn't happen, we introduced these little pinches in the river channel. And just by pinching the width of the channel, you increase the flow velocity. Just like when you're watering your garden and you're using the hose for watering and you want the water to go faster, you basically press it and you reduce the width. And that means the water has got more energy. And that's the principle of jet washing. So by introducing these pinches in the channel, we could accelerate the flow and make sure there is no fine sediment on dropping on the riffles. So to create the pool, finally, we created some little weirs with bricks. And this is an example of a brick. The result of a weir is that it's a drop. And when you've got a drop, you get a little waterfall. And when underneath the waterfall, you've got basically erosion, scour. So the bed is basically eroded. And that's what you need for a pool. So eventually, this site was monitored 3 years after the riffle was introduced. It was still functioning, and fish were reproducing in the riffle. So this is an example of what you can do in difficult environments where there are very strong constraints. Now, an even worse case of restoring forms in urban setting. This is Midsummer Norton in the town of Bath. And this was right in the town center. And what you can see here is like, you probably have like a few examples of these around your country and around your town. And what you've got is what we call like a U-box channel. So we've got walls on both sides, and underneath, probably at the bottom, you've got artificial bed. The river is over wide, it is straight, you can't change that, none of it can be changed. And there are houses literally on the bank. So you can't restore the connectivity of the river to the floodplain. It accumulated a lot of fine sediment, silt, a lot of vegetation. During hot summer, that would smell, and that wouldn't be like a particularly pleasant sight. So what can we do in this kind of environment? Well, you can do actually a lot. The design there was to basically create artificial berms here. We call them berms, but they're like kind of bars. And these artificial bars would be created with stones. There would be some textile put in the bottom, and whatever silt was in the channel was transferred to the bar. And then it was planted with vegetation. Yeah? This was done on both sides, and in such a way that it looks like the river is sinuous within the channel. And you can see a succession of these artificial berms there. And in the middle, the river was seeded with fresh gravel. So what we've got here is a faster flowing channel with gravel, and then we've got these berms which are restricting the width. It's the same trick as before. You reduce the width to increase flow velocity and to move the fine sediment so that you keep the channel and the gravel clean. Then you put in the vegetation that you plant, and this is what it looks like. So much better in terms of the ecological quality, biological quality, but also much better in terms of the looks of it for the residents. It was modeled for flood, and the changes didn't affect at all the flood risk in the area. So that was one of the things that was done on the requirement. What can we do about connectivity and processes affected by structures which are put in the channel? So this is an example of weir removal. That weir weirs are dams, basically, and this one was constructed with stones which were cemented together, but they've got a life of about like 50 years, and they start crumbling. And this one was starting. Whoops, sorry. This weir, particular weir, was starting crumbling in the middle, so it had to be replaced. The cost of replacement of the weir was something like £250,000 or 300,000 euros, if you want. It was a high cost of repair, and because of the drop, that weir was basically stopping fish, salmon, migrating upstream. So instead of replacing the weir, we offered them to do something different, which is to have a succession of smaller weirs that would mimic the kind of the natural structures that a river of that type creates, which we call a step pool sequence. And it's basically a step made of boulders or large stone, a pool underneath, another step, another pool, and so on. And this is the design we came up with. So you get here one of these steps with some loose boulders, a pool, then a kind of a small inset channel there, another step, and then another step, a pool, and so on and so forth. So the kind of 1 or 1.5 meter of the weir, the original weir, was basically distributed over a succession of smaller weirs, which means species and sediment could travel across all of them. And this is what it looked like. Basically, by the way, this is like the kind of case study you can download for free on our website. All these are available on our website. And this is what it looked like. So, can you see the weirs? They are much more difficult to spot, and it looks like much more like a natural environment. And look at the cost. Cost saving of 70% compared to restoring a full-blown engineering structure, which would have had to be replaced like some 35, 40 years later. So again, that's the kind of benefits you can get from this kind of practice. Now I'm going to show you a video. Every year we've got a conference, which is a networking conference, and all the people, engineering companies and members of the public and big organizations join in, and they present basically their work. And we've got a competition, which is called the River Prize, and they've got some of them submit their best achievements, and we elect who's going to be who's going to win the prize or not. I'm going to show you a series of videos. I'm not sure the sound's going to work. And this is a river which was in a very bad state of disrepair, and some of it was enclosed in a pipe. A lot of it was enclosed in a pipe. So the job they did was to reopen the pipe, remove the pipe, and reopen the river and let it basically reach the surface. So what you're seeing here is a result of the restoration. What is interesting, and in a way it links to the Creek Rákos, is that they created, in this whole area where they reopened the channel, they created also wetlands on the side. So they designed the channel so that it had like a marginal low slope area where vegetation could grow and where a range of species could thrive. They also dug a series of small ponds around, and some of them would be permanent ponds and others would be intermittent ponds, and that could host like a series of species. And that was done with involvement from the local community. So they had a lot of volunteers and a lot of people participating. This is a sediment trap they introduced, and that was to avoid fine sediment, especially polluted sediment, reaching the downstream area of the river. So the result from that was a massive increase. This is an example of one of the temporary ponds. literally dug out, and connection is put, when it's temporary, you let it be fed by flooding. The result of it was a massive increase in diversity. So yeah, increase of diversity in invertebrates. I think they more than double the number of species. They had fish as well, and then they had other species, land species as well, that got in. But one of the really like positive aspects were the involvement of the local community. So I'm going to show you now an example of restoring not only the connectivity, but also the processes and getting multiple benefits, a similar kind of thing. But again, I chose urban settings because of the kind of issues you've got around here and the location we are in. So this is an urban park, and that's River Quaggy. That was basically heavily modified. It's all concrete. It's got a small channel in there, concrete banks, concrete beds, and it had like these hedges, which means like nobody could see the river. What was decided there was to reinstate all the kind of river processes that could be reinstated. That meant removing, bringing back the river to its natural form. So before, we've worked within the channel, within the line that was drawn by the engineers in the past. In this case, we're breaking that line, and we are letting the river meander again. So we're restoring much more of the processes and the forms. So what you can observe here is the river was, not only the concrete was removed on banks and bed, but it was basically made sinuous across the channel. The other thing that's important is that the bank height was lower, which means that the river would be able to flood the park. So that kind of lateral connectivity was introduced. So this is what it looked like a few years later, after vegetation had time to establish itself. So there is massive improvements in ecology and biodiversity. And this is an example of a river in floods. So basically it would flood the park and provide benefits like additional flood storage. There was other benefits which were assessed, like access to wildlife. So a few dipping ponds were created so that local school children could come and sample invertebrates and have a look at them. So this was set up for educational purposes. But more importantly, a survey of local users of the park and local residents was made, and what it was found is that there was an increased perception of safety within the park since the restoration happened. So the local community felt safer actually being in that park, and they enjoyed it more. So we had multiple benefits, not just on the flood aspects, on the ecological aspects of the hydromorphology, but also on the societal aspect. Now I'm going to show you another video which I'll comment. This is another winner. So this is a river in Northern Ireland, which was, as you can see, in a very terrible state of repair. And what this shows is this example, the benefits of citizen science. So you see it's heavily modified. It's very deep. It's got artificial banks, and it's not a pretty site, and it's got a lot of rubbish. So the local community actually got together. That was a massive. They won one of the funders in the UK is a national lottery. So people bet every week to win money. And that money goes back towards environmental improvements, some of it. So in this case, they won the grant, and the grant involved developing a massive involvement from the local community. So they got school children involved, they've got like all the users, and they have like a fantastic campaign that brought everybody together to actually improve this river. And that was very important, and that defined the success of the schemes. I think these are ducks. I don't know if you don't do that, but there's a British thing, like where you do duck competition, you release them in the water, see how far they go. And so that was an example of involvement of the local community, and it led to a restoration which was fully appreciated and now really made a difference to people's well-being locally. Right, without the sound, I think I'm going to move on. So another example of restoring processes, forms, and connectivity. So we're moving towards more and deeper, like a restoration. This is Cinderland Brook in Manchester, a heavily realigned and modified channel. So built on a straight line, over deep, very constructed, and it had again limitations because there were these houses which were built literally on the floodplain. You've got to know one thing, that a natural river normally would flood an average of 1-2 times a year, or once or twice every year. So when you've got houses like that, if the river, they are in the floodplain, if the river is not managed, like dredged, over deepened, these houses would likely flood every couple of years. And that's not something which is acceptable. And this is the reason why we over deepen them in that way, because we want to create more space for water within the channel. So the UK standard is to have a flood risk of 1 in 25, 50 or 100 year. And to be able to go from 1 in 2 year to 1 in 100 year, you need to do a lot of work. You need to do a lot of digging. And this is the reason why rivers are so modified and affected. In the UK, actually, physical modification is the main cause of, one of the main causes of failure to the Water Framework Directive ecological objectives. Right, so what was decided there was basically to redevelop the channel. There was limitation because of the urban area, but there was an area of parkland that could be used. The capacity to convey water and flooding had to be kept to the same level. So how could it be done? Well, it was done by creating what we call a two-stage channel. So instead of having a really wide channel, which is really deep, you have like a narrow channel, which is shallow. And that narrow channel is going to basically meander across an artificial inset floodplain. Yeah, that's why we call it two-stage. So you're still in your deep trench, but at the bottom of that trench, there is an artificial floodplain, if you want, and you've got a more narrow and sinuous river. So that's what was done in this case. And that's the start of the work, basically, where the river was re-meandered, if you want, across the floodplain, and the floodplain was altered. And what that allows is that it allows the river to have like faster flows, which means like a better capacity to convey sediment, transport it, and to create habitats. And also it reconnects the river to the floodplain, so it enables flooding. So you get all the benefits of that kind of environment. And this is what it looked like later on. And what you can see, these features weren't created. This erosion wasn't created. All that happens afterwards. So what you get is like a more naturally looking channel, which is connected to its floodplain. But it is artificial still, because all this is happening at the bottom of a trench. And that trench is designed to prevent flooding and the flooding of the houses which are around. But it shows like how you can achieve a lot still, even in challenging environments. Finally, another example, another winner of the River Prize, and this one is Scotland, and that's the old Alt Lorgie. And this is an interesting one because somebody mentioned what does it cost to do the work? And river restoration can be very expensive. And the things that are expensive very often is to bring machinery to take sediment out or earth and then to move that earth. In the UK, you can't dump that earth anywhere. You've got to landfill it. So that river was basically heavily affected by a channel straightening, and that was because of agriculture. And what they did is because the system had enough energy, the restoration was quite simple. They used the energy of the system. This is what it looked like before. They used the energy of the system to recreate all these features. So these features, when created by the designer, look at these bars, all that was done by the river. And I'll show you, it's coming in a bit, how they did it. First, they removed all the reinforcement. In this case, they are the big blocks of rocks. And then they put large wood. And what large wood does, like trees, like you plant and across the river, is that it increases the flow velocities and it increases the energy. So they removed the embankments and then they put the material from the embankments in the channel, and then the river basically suddenly had the energy it needed to move that sediment, transport it a bit downstream, and recreate all the features they needed. So in this case, we call that assisted recovery, because the river cannot recover on its own, but it has the energy to do it. So all you did is to help it a bit. And you do that in that case by dropping large wood, trees, literally, in the channel. And this is the kind of tree that is massive that you put in there. There you go. Nice burn. Right. So these are the kind of solutions that you can adopt. You've also got, sometimes for restoration, what we deal with are simpler problems, and we devise simpler solutions to these problems. So you don't always have to go full on. Sometimes what we do is not restoration, is protection of the natural environment. So in this case, what you can see here is a meander bend with a bar, which is a natural accumulation of sediment. And people there had the impression that bar was causing a problem, and especially the engineers. And they said that bar is moving and is eroding the other side of the channel. And this is like a very common belief, which actually is not true. It's not the bar that creates the erosion, it's the erosion that creates the bar, completely the opposite. So to convince the local community and the engineers, all we did was to suggest to take some fixed point photography. So people would go a different time of the year and take a picture of the bar. And then over the years, over the months, we looked at whether the bar is moving or not. And surprisingly, it wasn't. So in this case, the success was nothing was done. Another simple solution, apart from doing nothing, is to prevent harm. This is an example of the River Cole, which has very intensive grazing pressure by animals. And the grazing basically means that the banks are weak. And if the banks are weak, what you get is a lot of erosion of the banks. So you can see these eroding cliffs there, and they're quite impressive in height and extent as well. So what was done is a simple solution, which is to prevent the grazing. And by preventing the grazing, basically you let the vegetation rehabilitate itself and strengthen the banks. In the UK, it was assessed that banks with mature vegetation, yield led basically to river channels which are 1/3 narrower than banks without vegetation. So fencing was put on top of the banks. And please concentrate on that little pole here. I'm going to show you how that changed. So that's 1996. The pole is here. That's year 2000. Year 2002, you see the growth of marginal vegetation increasing. This is in 2015, and this is the same brook, part of the river in 2015, sorry. So what we've observed then in the space of 20 years is massive growth of the vegetation and stabilization of the bank. So the erosion problem had gone, just because we removed the harm, we removed the access to the river by the cattle. Simple solutions as well. Restoration is not necessarily you do new things. It could be that you can do things differently. So this is an example of a stream in Northern Ireland, which was over wide with slow flow, full of silt, no vegetation, eroding, no plant, a lot of plants choking the channel during the summer, and not particularly good for wildlife. And because of silt accumulation, that stream had to be dredged, desilted on a regular basis. So the idea here is to do less desilting. And how this could be achieved? Well, same principle as before. You think river processes. What you need, if the silt is dropping, it means the energy is too low. So to increase the transport of silt and to prevent it from dropping, you basically have to increase the energy. And the easiest way of doing that in that kind of environment is reducing the width. You reduce the width, it's like the garden hose, the flow velocities increase. So the stream width was basically reduced by moving the silt around and creating a faster, narrower channel in the middle. And what that led to, it was pretty quick at recovering its natural habitats. So the maintenance would only happen within that area. And what happened is that the channel basically, using the vegetation, would rehabilitate itself and create that more sinuous pattern with faster flow velocities, and the silt that was on the side started vegetating, and that reduced basically the need for maintenance. This is another example, and we spend a lot of time doing this kind of work, which is we're not necessarily restoring rivers, but we're trying to help the people who actually damage them less. So we give training to engineers, for example, and we show them this kind of example. This one was of great interest to engineers in Northern Ireland, because there are lots of structures like bridges in Northern Ireland, and what they've done is to widen the river. So if you widen the river, little Paul, what happens to energy? Who thinks it increases? Decreases? Raise your hands. Yes, it decreases, which means the kind of process that happens there, what do you think? Erosion or deposition? Deposition? Yeah? So you get a lot of deposition of material in there. So the engineers there felt it was a problem because it increased flood risk. So what they would do is every year they would go, or every 2 years, they would go and they dredge all the gravel out and creating that massive pile on the side. Right. But when you dredge and you remove gravel, you create a hole in the ground. A hole means that you increase the slope. If you increase the slope, you get more energy because the water's falling faster. So it starts eroding the bed. And gradually, what you can see here is how basically the maintenance started undermining the foundation of the bridge that they were trying to protect. Okay? And that's not just that bridge. Can you see that here? This is a wall, and this was the base of the wall at the time they constructed it. So quite a lot of bed incision. So the answer in that case was stop doing maintenance. Because at the end of the day, the thing they didn't understand is that a gravel bar is a dynamic environment and it will find its equilibrium. Every year, some gravel will be taken away and replaced with new gravel, but not necessarily more. So your bar will keep its own size. And that's what they did. And the result was the river found its new equilibrium, and you got these gravel bars developing and not really increasing in size. And the benefit, there was even benefit to the engineers in that the gravel accumulation accumulated at the bottom of engineering structures providing protection to the structures. So, as we say, double whammy. Right, other simple solutions. Somebody mentioned in the talk green engineering. So we developed with another organization a green infrastructure river restoration kind of manual with all the kind of green solutions to your environmental problems. So this is examples of river restoration or management, if you want, with, it's not really restoration, it's more like management in this case, using green infrastructure. In this case, is using these willow, branches of willow there. And there was a point of erosion here on the riverbank, not far away where my boss lives. And he actually advised them to use these willows and put them against the bank. It's called willow spiling. It can be done by hand. It can be done quite quickly. I think that was done in less than a day. And that actually is very resistant to fast flows. So this is the same bank in a flood and after the flood. And as you can see, the flood hasn't affected the bank anymore. So the advantage of these kind of techniques is that the plants are going to start growing on the bank and naturally reinforcing the bank. So this is quite a cheap and easy way of managing erosion where it is causing troubles. This is what it looked like in the spring, and you can see the development of the vegetation and the growth of vegetation at the bottom. You can do the same kind of thing. If you haven't got willows, you can do it with Christmas trees. And this is an example of using Christmas trees here to reinforce an eroding bank. But if you are in a really fast-flowing, high-energy environment, these two techniques are not going to work because all the material is going to be taken away. So this is the kind of technique that is used in Scotland in high-energy systems, which is using these massive trees with the roots. And the roots are exposed, and you basically dig a trench in the bank, and you put the tree in that trench, and you let the roots out. And what the roots do is to deflect the fast flow and reduce the erosion. So there is a whole range of techniques you can apply which are not hard engineering techniques and which are very effective and much more environmentally friendly. So we've been talking about citizen science, and this is another case study example, which is the River Telford, where the local community was heavily involved, and it was involved in the restoration of the river. So it's a river that was again in a really bad state of disrepair. And somebody mentioned before, like working together, where they called their movement together. And they basically involved a lot of volunteers. I think they had more than 200 events that they organized with the local community and the volunteers. So they involved schools and everyone else. So there was a lot of local community involvement. And obviously the kind of projects and the type of project, the citizen science project, are really key in like empowering the local community, as Luigi said earlier. The empowerment is really a key thing, because the empowerment is part of the sustainability of the project. Right, I think that's, I'm going to leave it there, but I'm going to give you like, first like the last slide on the manual of river restoration technique. As Hannah said, we were set up in 1994. And one of the first jobs we were given as a river restoration center, I think we were probably the first river restoration center. One of the jobs we were given was to put together a manual of techniques. And at the beginning, it was basically trial and error. So it's trying to figure out what works, what doesn't work. And the best techniques were put together in a manual. And the manual is actually available for free online. So it's an open resource, open access resource. If you want a printed copy, you can ask us. It's being translated in Chinese, believe it or not. But it's available there. And there's much more on our website, which is available for free. So we've got also a manual for monitoring, of monitoring techniques. And again, that's on the website. We've got case studies. There is a lot of free stuff, so please get in there and have a look. And if you have any questions, just send us an email. If you want to stay in touch with us, you can ask us to put you on the mailing list, and then regularly we will send you, there is a monthly bulletin, and we'll send you some updates of things that are going on and so on. So, to summarize, what we try to convey with Hannah is that river restoration is a process. And that process is extremely important, because traditionally what we've been doing is opportunistic river restoration. Wherever there is a nice landowner, wherever there is a bit of money, and we can find a problem to sort, there we get in and we do it. But what difference does it make? And that's the question. What difference does it make to the species, communities, and even like to the people across the catchment? So we're trying to move away from that, look at, analyze, understand the river at the scale of the catchment, figure out the pressures and the impact at the scale of the catchment. And thanks to the Water Framework Directive, we now have targets. We know what we're managing. We are managing the biology, the ecology at the catchment scale. And so we need to develop that sound understanding of the river. Hence, we advocate the kind of framework that Hannah showed you. And based on that, prioritize the kind of restoration measures. They do not have to be full expensive restoration. As I showed you, sometimes the best thing is to do nothing, or drop a bit of wood if there is enough energy. But to be able to figure that out, you need to know the importance of energy in driving the river processes, the sediment transport, the erosion and deposition. And once you know that, you can basically design a series of measures which will really make a difference and which are much more sustainable than just doing some landscape gardening, if you want. So if you know, well, obviously you're good in English. We've got a lot of tools online. We run training online as well. If you want advice from us, you can contact us. The important thing is always, and that's the thing that very often people who do restoration don't do, which is to monitor. Because you need to learn from mistakes. And often it's not going to work. And the best learning comes from the mistakes. So it's something that's keeping in mind, always keeping time for monitoring. And very often monitoring is not done because it's expensive. And the other reason is funding. Because nobody funds you, like our project is funded for so many years, but we're not funded to monitor ironically, the impact of our project. Yet our project is about monitoring impacts. And that's the irony of things, but that's how a lot of funding happens. But you've got citizen science, so if you empower enough local people, show them how to do the monitoring themselves, it's important that that monitoring means something. The best monitoring, citizen science monitoring that happens in the UK is where the people doing the monitoring, when they find a problem, it goes directly to the environmental organization, the Environment Agency, and the Environment Agency then takes action. So the app is linked to the Environment Agency. They find a problem, that problem, if it's deemed to be strong enough and serious enough, then there is action. And that's the important thing. It's not getting citizens to collect data for the sake of it. And then things can work really well. So on that positive note, thank you very much for your attention.
Let me ask the audience if you have questions or remarks about the presentation.
Fluently English, which csak magyarul jó, fordítva. Congratulations, very interesting was it. A költséghatékonyság nálunk nagyon izgalmas rész, mert nálunk szeretnek drágán építkezni. Hogy erről egy adatot mondott, hogy 70%-kal volt olcsóbb egy ökológiai megoldás, mint egy általános vízépítészeti megoldás, de hogy általában vannak-e adataik, ez érdekelne, mert ez egy nagyon-nagyon izgalmas, és nagyon köszönjük, szuper volt.
Yeah.
You told us about one example of cost-benefit analysis or cost and benefits, that the natural solutions are, or in that case, were 70% cheaper than the grey solution. So do you have data or examples also for those?
I do not know on top of my head, but yes, we would have other examples. What we tend to do when we do a catchment plan is we look at the pressures and the impact, and then we offer a series of restoration measures. And we've got an Excel spreadsheet with costs for each type of intervention, going from hard engineering down to green solutions. And then we offer a series of different options, and then we assess the cost of each option and also how much they will impact on the biological target or the ecological targets, like the Water Framework Directive objectives. So these are basically quite a long table per each, your options, costed, benefits, and that's for the decision makers to think about which one they want to go for. Yeah, so, but we've got a table of costs, and that's what we use. But very often it's not detailed costs, because if you want detailed costs, you need to send an engineer. It's very expensive, so it's generally round figures. Yeah.
Is there any other question or remark? One and there.
5 évet voltam a vízügyben, és tudjátok, hogy volt a Tiszának a ciánszennyezése. És ez egy fantasztikus élmény volt, hogy a vízügy, azért a magyar vízügyet dicsérni is kell, mert nem tudom, mennyire hallottatok róla, hogy a holtágakat lezárták rögtön, szerencsére januárban volt ugye az egész, lezárták a holtágakat, és amikor levonult a cián, akkor utána megnyitották. Olyan természetes revitalizáció indult meg a Tiszában, amiről nem sokat beszéltek, csak a média csak a horrort szereti mutatni, hogy az összes gyomfaj az egy purgáló hatása volt. És utána olyan fajgazdagság volt a cián után, és ezekből a holtágokból, tehát ez is egy ökológiai védés, hogy a holtágak azok egy rezidiumok.
She was for many years at the water authorities working, and water authorities are not just enemies, but they are doing good deeds as well. When there was a big cyanide pollution along the Tisza River, then they closed down the Oxbow lakes, where nature could be preserved, and in the mainstream the invasive species literally died out, and a natural process could revitalize then the mainstream. So that was the point of this comment.
Yeah, we work a lot with water companies. So some of the work we do is funded by water companies, and at that moment we're doing research on the Water Framework Directive. We try to build simple models describing pressures and impacts on hydromorphology and species, and that's funded by the water companies because it's in their interest. They extract water, and sometimes they are blamed for the lack of species. Yet a lot of the rivers suffer from multiple causes of impacts, and for example dredging, straightening, over-widening and so on. So they want to understand the combination, how the combination of these pressures affect the species. So water companies, environmental organizations, a lot of stakeholders actually participate and are interested in this problem, and that's also in their interest because they get bad reputation from pollution incidents and so on, and they want to make sure they lessen their impact.
Is there any other comment? Yes, we have.
Any other question? No? Maybe if your conclusion, can I?
Yeah, but I still have a question.
Ah, yeah.
Okay. So I have a question on the stewardship model of rivers and maybe of restoration and monitoring. I know that in the United Kingdom you have this model connected somehow to the management. If you could devote some sentences and explain us, maybe it would be a complete presentation, but what's the point, and maybe how could the citizens involved in such a model?
Right.
If that's a too complex question?
No, it's not too complex. What the government did in, there's a cynical view around it. It's like after the financial crisis, there was clearly a lack of money and a reduction in funding from a lot of things. So the government called on the help of citizens and they called that the big society at the time, to help with all sorts of issues happening in society. And one of the aspects was the environmental management. So what they did, and which was really positive, is a series of organizations, rivers trusts, were set up around the country, and each trust will cover a catchment, quite a big catchment. And these trusts, basically their job was to be the link with the civil society and with the volunteers and the environmental organizations like the Environment Agency. And around this relationship that was built, basically citizen science appeared, and we got like more and more citizens involved in environmental monitoring and management. And at the moment, at least the English Environment Agency is kind of given to some of these trusts in relationship with all the big companies in the catchment that regulate rivers, like the water company and so on, and they create what they call a catchment partnership. And that partnership includes the trusts, it includes the Environment Agency, local authority, municipalities, business, private business and so on, and they discuss together how we can improve the river system. And with one of them, not far away where we are based in the east of England, we basically have volunteers doing what Hannah presented, which is a survey of the catchment, and they're trying to figure out the pressures, the impacts, then figure out the restoration plan, and then that plan is then put back to all the members of the catchment partnership, and some funding is sought from government and other sources to basically deal with it. So there's this kind of a model which was pretty organic. It just happened, but it was led also by the government and the big organizations.
There is any other question? No? Well, let me spend a minute to conclude from my side. So I would like to actually thank Marc, because I learned a lot. I'm not a river restoration expert, so it was very interesting also for me. I would like to thank Balázs for all the organization that was fantastic. And because, I mean, both Marc and I have been adopted by the UK, so we live and work there. We are not originally from there. And this project mix, like the project that Alexandra from ESSRG mentioned, these are European Union projects. And it's good to see that at least in the field of science, the UK, that is not in the EU anymore, and the EU are still collaborating. And this is a good sign that we don't need to separate everything. There are things that is good to go on doing together. But also, this is public money. This is money coming from the EU. So also a big thank to you, because at the end, all this exists because there are people paying taxes, and these taxes, luckily, is also used to fund these projects, this research, and this science. So from my side, thanks a lot for also all your welcoming.
Thank you very much, Luigi. And thank you very much for Marc and Hannah for this nice presentation.